Bully pulls officer's hair in bar. Seconds later, he's crawling in blood. Quinlan Merriweather adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses for the third time in 5 minutes as he nursed his ginger ale at Murphy's Tavern. His slight frame hunched over the weathered mahogany bar, shoulders rounded inward like a turtle retreating into its shell. At 5'7" and barely 140 pounds, Quinlan looked more like a substitute teacher than someone who wore a badge and carried a service weapon. His sandy brown hair hung limply over his forehead, and his pale complexion bore the marks of someone who spent more time behind a desk than in the field. The tavern buzzed with the usual Friday evening crowd from Millbrook, a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Construction workers, still dusted with concrete powder, occupied the corner booths, while office workers loosened their ties and complained about deadlines. Quinlan preferred the anonymity of sitting alone at the bar, hoping to blend into the background like wallpaper. Well, if it isn't the department's little bookworm," a gravelly voice announced behind him. Quinlan's stomach tightened as he recognized the voice of Wade Hutchins, a towering 6'3" mountain of muscle who worked as a foreman at the local concrete plant. Wade's crew cut revealed a spiderweb tattoo creeping up his neck, and his arms bulged beneath a grimy Carhartt shirt. Behind him stood his perpetual shadows, Tommy Briggs, a wiry man with shifty eyes and grease-stained fingers from his job at the auto shop, and Rex Morrison, whose beer gut stretched his Patriots jersey to its limits. "Just trying to enjoy a quiet drink," Quinlan mumbled, not turning around. Wade's meaty hand clamped down on Quinlan's shoulder, spinning him around on the bar stool. "What's that, pencil pusher? Can't hear you when you're mumbling into your little kiddie drink." The surrounding patrons glanced over with mild interest before quickly returning to their conversations. This wasn't the first time Wade had targeted Quinlan, and the locals had learned that intervention wasn't worth the trouble. Better to let Wade have his fun and move on. "I said I'm just having a drink," Quinlan repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Tommy snickered and nudged Rex. "Look at him shake. Bet he's never even fired that gun they gave him." "Probably keeps the bullets in a separate drawer," Rex added, causing Wade to bark out a laugh. Quinlan felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creep up his neck. They weren't entirely wrong. His role at the Millbrook Police Department involved mostly paperwork, evidence cataloging, and administrative duties. Chief Harrison had made it clear that Quinlan's strengths lay in organization and analysis, not street patrol. The badge felt heavier in his wallet every time Wade reminded him how little he belonged among real law enforcement. "You know what your problem is, Merriweather?" Wade leaned in close, his breath reeking of cheap beer and cigarettes. "You're all uniform and no spine. Hide behind that badge all day, then come skulking around here like some kind of ghost." The bartender, Mickey O'Sullivan, wiped down glasses with deliberate focus, avoiding eye contact. Mickey had served Wade's family for 2 generations and knew better than to get involved in their business. Besides, Wade and his crew were regular customers who dropped decent money every week. Quinlan slid off the bar stool, leaving a $5 bill on the bar. "I should get going." "Running away again." Wade's hand shot out, gripping Quinlan's wrist. "Seems like every time we try to have a friendly conversation, you disappear." "Please let go," Quinlan said quietly, his eyes fixed on Wade's massive hand, wrapped around his thin wrist like a vice. Wade's grip tightened. "What are you gonna do? Arrest me? Rid me my rights in that little mouse voice of yours?" More patrons turned to watch the spectacle unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed entertained by the show. A few women near the jukebox whispered among themselves, shooting sympathetic glances toward Quinlan that only deepened his humiliation. "Just leave me alone, Wade," Quinlan managed, finally meeting the bigger man's eyes. Wade released his wrist with a dismissive shove that sent Quinlan stumbling backward into another patron's chair. "There's the backbone we've been looking for. Keep working on that tough guy act, officer." As Quinlan straightened his jacket and headed for the exit, Tommy called out, "Hey, Merriweather, Don't forget to check under your bed tonight. Might be monsters waiting to get you. The laughter followed him out into the crisp October evening. Quinlan sat in his Honda Civic for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The radio crackled with routine dispatch calls that reminded him of the world he barely participated in. Real officers were out there handling domestic disputes, traffic stops, and break-ins, while he filed reports and updated databases. What Wade and his crew didn't know, what nobody in Millbrook knew, was that Quinlan Merriweather had spent 12 years studying Krav Maga and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu before joining the police department. His instructor, Sergeant Major David Chen, had been a Green Beret who'd insisted that true warriors used violence as a last resort. A weapon unused is sometimes more powerful than one deployed, Chen had taught him, but when the time comes, hesitation kills. Quinlan had never mentioned his martial arts background during the hiring process, and Chief Harrison had assigned him to administrative duties based on his college degree in criminal justice and his quiet demeanor. It seemed easier to let people assume he was just another desk jockey than explain why someone with his training chose to avoid confrontation. But each encounter with Wade made it harder to maintain that facade. The following Tuesday, Quinlan arrived at Murphy's Tavern earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the evening rush and Wade's crew. He'd had a particularly frustrating day organizing evidence for a robbery case that real detectives would handle, and he needed the familiar comfort of his corner bar stool and Mickey's wordless understanding. "The usual?" Mickey asked, already reaching for the ginger ale. "Actually, make it a beer tonight," Quinlan said, surprising them both. Mickey raised an eyebrow but pulled a Budweiser from the cooler. "Rough day?" Before Quinlan could answer, the door chime announced new arrivals. His stomach dropped as Wade's booming laughter filled the tavern, followed by Tommy and Rex's familiar cackling. But tonight, they weren't alone. A woman walked beside them, her auburn hair catching the dim bar lights like copper wire. Quinlan recognized her immediately. Cassie Fleming, the new librarian who'd moved to Millbrook from Boston 3 months ago. She wore a simple green dress that complemented her fair complexion and carried herself with quiet confidence. Quinlan had noticed her during his occasional visits to the library, admiring her ability to handle the town's more difficult patrons with diplomatic firmness. "Cassie here was just telling us about city life," Wade announced loudly, his hand resting possessively on her lower back. "Think she needs someone to show her how we do things in the real world?" Cassie's smile looked strained as she glanced around the tavern. Her eyes briefly met Quinlan's across the room, and he saw something that looked like a plea for rescue. "I really should get home," Cassie said, attempting to step away from Wade's grip. "Early morning tomorrow." Come on, the night's just getting started," Rex chimed in, moving to block her path to the door. "We were going to show you the pool table in back." "I don't really play pool," Cassie replied, her voice maintaining its polite tone despite the obvious discomfort. Tommy grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "We'll teach you. Real hands-on instruction." Quinlan's fingers tightened around his beer bottle. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, but years of conditioning held him frozen on his bar stool. These weren't petty bullies picking on him anymore. This was something worse, and Cassie was trapped in it. Wade's eyes scanned the tavern and locked onto Quinlan. "Hey, look who's here. Our favorite pretend cop. Maybe he can give you some pointers on personal safety, Cassie. Show you all those self-defense moves they don't teach." The sarcasm in Wade's voice made several patrons chuckle. Cassie followed his gaze and recognized Quinlan from the library, though they'd never spoken beyond basic pleasantries. "Actually, I think I'll just head home," Cassie said more firmly, trying again to move toward the exit. Wade's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, the same grip he'd used on Quinlan days earlier. "Whoa there, city girl. Didn't say you could leave yet." The tavern went quiet, except for the low hum of the jukebox playing an old Garth Brooks song. Mickey continued polishing glasses, his movements more mechanical than before. The other patrons found sudden interest in their drinks or conversations, anything to avoid witnessing what was happening. Quinlan stood up from his bar stool, his legs shaky, but his decision clear. "Let her go, Wade." "Well, well," Wade said, not releasing Cassie's wrist. "Look who found his voice. You gonna do something about it, officer? Gonna arrest me for talking to a pretty lady?" "Just let her leave," Quinlan said, taking a step forward despite every survival instinct telling him to run. Tommy moved to flank Quinlan's right side, while Rex positioned himself to the left. Wade's grip on Cassie tightened until she winced. "You know what I think?" Wade said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "I think you've been playing dress-up cop for so long, you actually believe you're tough. Time for a reality check." What happened next unfolded in slow motion. Wade shoved Cassie aside, sending her stumbling into a nearby table. She caught herself, but her purse spilled its contents across the floor. Wade took 3 quick strides toward Quinlan, his massive frame casting a shadow across the smaller man. "This is your last chance to walk away," Wade growled, "unless you want to find out what happens to fake cops who stick their nose where it don't belong." Quinlan's training kicked in, analyzing Wade's stance, his positioning, the angle of his approach. 12 years of discipline warred with 12 months of conditioning that told him to back down, apologize, disappear. "I won't ask again," Quinlan said quietly. "Leave her alone." Wade's laugh was harsh and brutal. "You won't ask again? What are you gonna do? Write me a ticket?" Without warning, Wade lunged forward and grabbed a handful of Quinlan's sandy hair, yanking his head back with vicious force. Pain exploded across Quinlan's scalp as Wade's fingers twisted deeper into his hair. "This is what happens to heroes, Merriweather," Wade snarled, his face inches from Quinlan's. "They get their pretty little heads ripped off." Something snapped inside Quinlan. Not his hair, not his composure, but the carefully constructed wall between who he was and who he'd trained to be. 12 years of Sergeant Major Chen's teachings flooded through him like electricity through water. Wade never saw the elbow strike coming. Quinlan's right elbow shot upward with lightning precision, connecting with Wade's solar plexus with a sickening thud. Wade's grip on Quinlan's hair loosened as all the air exploded from his lungs. Before Wade could recover, Quinlan spun inside his guard and drove his knee upward into Wade's ribs. The sound of cracking bone echoed through the silent tavern like gunshots. Wade's eyes went wide with shock and pain as he stumbled backward. Tommy rushed forward with a wild haymaker punch, but Quinlan had already shifted into combat mode. He ducked under Tommy's swing and swept his legs, sending the wiry man crashing into a table that splintered under his weight. Glasses shattered and beer pooled across the floor like amber blood. Rex charged from the left, his beer gut leading the assault. Quinlan sidestepped and used Rex's momentum against him, grabbing his shirt and throwing him into the bar with a technique Chen had drilled into him 10,000 times. Rex's head bounced off the mahogany with a sound like a bowling ball hitting pins. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds. Wade struggled to his feet, one hand pressed against his broken ribs, the other reaching toward his back pocket. Quinlan recognized the movement. Wade was going for a weapon, probably a knife. "Don't," Quinlan said, his voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there minutes earlier. "It's over." Wade's hand froze. Something in Quinlan's tone, in his stance, in the way he held himself after dismantling 3 men twice his size, made Wade reconsider. Tommy groaned from the wreckage of the table, and Rex slumped against the bar, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. "Who the hell are you?" Wade gasped, still clutching his ribs. Quinlan straightened his glasses and smoothed down his hair where Wade had grabbed it. "I'm exactly who I've always been. You just never bothered to look." The tavern remained frozen in stunned silence. Mickey stood behind the bar with his mouth hanging open, a dish rag dripping forgotten in his hand. The construction workers stared from their corner booth, their conversations dying mid-sentence. Even the jukebox seemed quieter, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Cassie had gathered her scattered belongings and now stood near the door, her green eyes wide with disbelief. She looked at Quinlan as if seeing him for the first time. Not the quiet, bookish man who'd been invisible in her peripheral vision, but someone entirely different. "You okay?" Quinlan asked her, his voice returning to its familiar soft tone. She nodded, still speechless. Wade spat blood onto the floor, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. "This isn't over, Merriweather." "Not by a long shot." "Yes, it is," Quinlan said calmly. "And if you ever put your hands on another woman in this town, or if you ever threaten someone who can't defend themselves, we'll have this conversation again. Except next time, I won't stop when you hit the ground." The promise wasn't delivered with bravado or shouting. Quinlan's matter-of-fact tone made it more terrifying than any threat Wade had ever heard. This wasn't the timid desk jockey he'd been tormenting. This was someone who could break him in half without breaking a sweat. Tommy struggled to his feet, glass crunching under his boots. "Come on, Wade, let's get out of here." Rex pushed himself away from the bar, swaying slightly from the head injury. The three men limped toward the exit, their usual swagger replaced by the awkward shuffle of defeated animals. At the door, Wade turned back one final time. "You got lucky tonight, Merriweather." "No," Quinlan replied, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "You did." After the door slammed behind them, the tavern slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, but every eye remained fixed on Quinlan. Mickey emerged from behind the bar to survey the damage, shaking his head at the broken furniture and scattered glass. "Hell of a thing," Mickey muttered. "Never seen anything like that." Quinlan pulled out his wallet and placed several $20 bills on the bar. "For the damages." "That's way too much," Mickey protested. "Keep it," Quinlan said. He turned to Cassie, who still stood near the door. "Can I walk you to your car?" She nodded, and together they stepped out into the cool evening air. The parking lot was quiet except for the distant sound of Wade's truck peeling out onto Main Street. "Are you really a police officer?" Cassie asked as they reached her Honda Accord. "Administrative duties mostly," Quinlan replied. "Filing reports, organizing evidence, that sort of thing." "That wasn't filing reports in there," she said with a small smile. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" For the first time in months, Quinlan felt no shame in answering honestly. "My instructor used to say that the best fights are the ones you never have to finish. Tonight was the first time I didn't have a choice." Cassie studied his face in the streetlight. "Why didn't you ever stand up to them before?" Quinlan was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "I guess I thought if I stayed invisible long enough, they'd eventually get bored and move on. Turns out some people mistake kindness for weakness. And now they know better." Cassie opened her car door but didn't get in right away. "Thank you. For tonight. I was starting to worry about how that was going to end." "You shouldn't have to worry about that," Quinlan said. "Nobody should." She started the engine and rolled down her window. "Maybe I'll see you at the library sometime. I mean, for an actual conversation." "I'd like that," Quinlan admitted. As Cassie drove away, Quinlan stood alone in the parking lot, feeling different than he had in years. Not because he'd won a fight, but because he'd finally stopped losing one that had been going on far too long. The following week brought subtle but significant changes to Millbrook. Wade and his crew still frequented Murphy's Tavern, but they occupied a different corner and kept their voices down. They no longer scanned the room looking for targets, and they gave Quinlan's usual spot at the bar a wide berth. More importantly, word had spread throughout the town about what happened that Friday night. The story grew with each telling, but the core truth remained. The quiet police officer who everyone had dismissed as harmless had turned out to be anything but. At the police station, Chief Harrison called Quinlan into his office on Monday morning. Heard you had some excitement over the weekend. Quinlan tensed, wondering if he was in trouble for the tavern incident. Yes, sir. Mickey O'Sullivan's cousin is married to my sister, Chief Harrison said with a slight smile. Word travels fast in a small town. He said Wade Hutchins and his boys won't be bothering folks anymore. I hope not, sir. Chief Harrison leaned back in his chair. You know, I've been thinking we might have you wrong. All this time we've had you pushing papers when maybe you should be out there with the rest of the squad. What do you think about some patrol training? For the first time since joining the department, Quinlan felt like he truly belonged. I'd like that very much, sir. 3 months later, Officer Quinlan Merriweather walked his regular evening patrol through downtown Millbrook. His uniform fit differently now, not just because he'd put on muscle from active duty, but because he wore it with the confidence of someone who'd earned his place. As he passed Murphy's Tavern, he could hear the familiar sounds of Friday night conversation and laughter. Through the window, he spotted Cassie at a corner table with her book club friends, animated discussion flowing around steaming mugs of coffee. She caught his eye and waved, mouthing, "See you later," with a smile that made his heart skip. Near the bar, Wade Hutchins sat hunched over a beer, his crew notably absent. The foreman had kept his job, but lost his swagger, and rumors suggested his wife had finally had enough of his drinking and temper. He was alone now in ways that had nothing to do with physical proximity. Quinlan felt no satisfaction in Wade's diminished state. Violence had been necessary that night, but it wasn't something to celebrate. The real victory wasn't in proving he could fight, it was in discovering he didn't have to hide anymore. As he continued his patrol down Main Street, Quinlan reflected on Sergeant Major Chen's favorite lesson. Strength isn't about what you can break, it's about what you choose to protect and when you choose to stop. That night in Murphy's Tavern, Quinlan had finally learned the difference between being peaceful and being powerless. Sometimes, the greatest kindness required the courage to stand up, speak out, and fight back. Not for revenge, but for the simple principle that good people shouldn't have to live in fear. The boy who'd been bullied was gone, replaced by a man who understood that true strength meant using power responsibly, protecting those who needed protection, and knowing when enough was truly enough. In a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, Quinlan Merriweather had finally found his place, not as the invisible man trying to disappear, but as the guardian standing quietly in the light.